Hi, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute so the people in the waiting room can join us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Okay, I think we've about 22 attendees. We can get started. Welcome to today's webinar. It is the first one that the Housing Alliance is hosting this year, and it is going to be on LandBanks, on LandBanks 101. This webinar will run for approximately an hour. And before we get started, I just want to quickly give you a rundown of who we are. The Housing Alliance is a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. Webinars are free for members, so do become a member if you aren't already. You can visit housingalliancepa.org/become a member or contact us at info@housingalliance for more information. Gonna get the next slide. So to ask questions to the Housing Alliance staff, please use the chat function that you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can also leave questions for the presenters. The Q&A box can also be found at the bottom part of your screen. We will send you a recording of the presentation and any materials that will be presented within a few days of this webinar. Lastly, I just want to quickly talk about a couple of events that are going to be happening. First, we have the Rural Pennsylvania Housing Summit, which will be on July 23rd from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. It will be at the Nittany Lion Inn at State College. We moved to more of a central location compared to like Seven Springs, which is where we were last year. We do have a few more upcoming webinars. The next one will be on April 24th. It will be on the RAD program. And then we have one on May 6th, which is the updates on home energy rebate programs with the DEP. So if you're interested in any of these webinars, do subscribe to our newsletters or become a member. With that, I will pass it over to Winnie. Thank you, Winnie, Joe, and Andrew for being with us today.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be here today. I'm going to share my screen and then get us started. So I have been working with the Housing Alliance and LandBanks across Pennsylvania since about 2014. So I am passionate about LandBanks. I love what they're able to do and how they're able to help communities. So I hope everybody's seeing my screen that says LandBanks 101. And I want to thank right now Joe Chacke and Andrew French for joining me. I've learned over the last couple of years that some of the material about the law and setting up a land bank can be pretty dry. So that when you want to really think about it, it's really great to talk directly to the land bank leaders. So I asked Joe and Andrew to join me today. After I fulfill the role of teacher trainer by covering LandBanks 101, I'm going to ask Joe and Andrew a couple of questions, and then we're going to open the questions up to you. So we're happy to see you here today, and we're anxious to get started and tell you all about land banks. So I'd like to start by talking about the problem, and the problem is blighted properties. They're vacant, they're abandoned, they're tax delinquent, and they need to be addressed in order to promote public health and safety, in order to revitalize communities, provide housing, and deter crime and other awful social ills that are related to vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties. And over time in Pennsylvania, the legislature, working with a whole coalition of folks, have designed and adopted a whole host of blight tools that I'll talk briefly about before we get started right into the land banks. So start with who's in charge, right? So if you're a property owner, you have some basic responsibilities to maintain your property, following the local codes and any state law. It's when the owner fails to maintain the property or abandons it altogether that government is left holding the bag and with responsibility for doing something about it. Usually local officials are contacted and asked, what are you going to do about this property? What can you do about this property? And they are often not sure what to do with the property. And they look at the tools that have been developed and evaluate those in terms of what tool can I use in order to address this property. So what can be done? This publication from the Housing Alliance is sometimes referred to as the Blight Bible. It's called From Blight to Bright. When the slides are circulated, you'll have links. There's links on many of these slides to the resources I'll talk about. But this manual is a real godsend for local governments and community leaders looking to address properties. It was published by the Housing Alliance in 2014. There's some updates on the website too, the Housing Alliance's website that provide some additional information. But this is a key resource that you should have if you are at all interested in dealing with blighted properties in your community. So in the manual, the tools that are described and evaluated and assessed in there are split into two categories. The first category is those tools that prevent and eliminate blight, like an International Property Maintenance Code, home repair, grants and funding to help owners keep their properties in compliance. And then there's a second set of tools that are used to address the long-term vacant, abandoned, blighted properties. And within that set of tools are land banks. So what is a land bank? You'll see a couple highlighted phrases in this slide, and those are the ones you want to focus on. It's a governmental entity. In some jurisdictions, land banks are nonprofit organizations or other types of entities, but in Pennsylvania, a land bank is a governmental entity. Only a government can create a land bank. Land banks have certain unique powers that we'll talk about briefly. And the goal of using those powers is to put those vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties back to productive use, but not just any productive use. The land bank is a partner with the communities where it operates, and the land bank is designed to help communities implement their community goals for land use, for housing, for public space and recreation. So the land bank is a partner to enable and implement land use and other plans for community activities. So Pennsylvania adopted its land bank law in 2012. It really was, and I think they call it the second or third wave of land banks. We followed the lead of other states like Michigan, Ohio, and New York. As I mentioned before, they can only be created by governmental entities, so they're considered public entities. To create a land bank, the land bank jurisdiction, which is a county, a municipality, or group of municipalities, they have to adopt an ordinance. There has to be legal requirements that are set forth in the ordinance that authorize the creation of a land bank. So why land banks, right? Why do we need a land bank? Why are land banks useful tools? Well, here are just some of the reasons why land banks are effective in dealing with those long-term vacant, blighted, and abandoned properties. The tool has been proven in other jurisdictions, and now it's proven in Pennsylvania. It helps to remove barriers that keep properties stuck in the market, like tangled title, an abundance of liens and claims on the property that are equal to greater than the fair market value for the property, which means that property is never being sold in the real estate market. The other reasons to create land banks are that blighted properties, responsibility for those are dispersed among different agencies, different government levels, different departments within governments. And the idea was to create some kind of uniform, predictable, and transparent process. So those interested in repurposing those properties would have some system to look to. And then lastly is, and this is where the land banks in Pennsylvania are evolving, to be that central hub, right? You want one place to go to. Where can I go to where I'm going to know where I know I'm going to get resources to help me prevent blight and then mitigate blight that exists in my community? And when the law was passed, really the sentiment across Pennsylvania was that the status quo is unacceptable. This is opportunities lost with these underutilized and blighted properties. So the goal was to create a new system, and land banks are that system for at scale community revitalization and turnarounds for blighted properties. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the land bank's core powers. The biggest and most loved power that land banks have is their ability to acquire tax foreclosed property cost effectively. And I will get into that a little bit later. The second core power is they can sell property to a responsible buyer or developer, and it doesn't have to be sold to the highest bidder. It can be sold based on what the outcome is that's going to happen if you transfer a property to this developer or buyer. What are they going to do with the property? And does that align with the community goals? Third, land banks have the ability to extinguish liens and clear title. We'll get into that power again in a couple minutes. Another important power of a land bank, like other governmental entities, it holds property tax exempt. So once a land bank acquires a property, it's not paying real estate taxes on that property unless there's certain conditions that are met, which haven't been met, I don't think, in Pennsylvania yet. And then lastly, it has to make some money, right? Because there's no state funding for land banks. So its core powers relate to its ability to generate and collect revenue. There's a couple of things in the land bank law that allows the land bank to retain the proceeds from sales. There's a property tax recapture provision where the local government and the school district and the county all agreed to this tax share program after the property is returned to productive use. And last, I want to highlight that land banks don't have eminent domain power. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about land banks created by being designated, the Redevelopment Authority being designated as the land bank. And in those instances, the Redevelopment Authority would have eminent domain power, but when it puts on its land bank hat and is operating as the county land bank or the local land bank, it would not be able to exercise eminent domain power. It would have to stick with the powers of land banks as outlined in the state land bank law. So this slide for me is really the key. If you take a slide and you think about the big picture, it's these three components: acquire, eliminate, transfer. You want to get the property. You need to get title to the property in order to do the things that are necessary to bring it up to code and repurpose it. You need to eliminate those liabilities that are weighing the property down, like liens, any other clouds on title that you can work as the land bank to eliminate in partnership with the taxing bodies and other partners. And then last, as I just mentioned, you have that flexibility to transfer to new owners. So you're actually putting a new owner in that property through the land bank. And that is often necessary when you have these long-term vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent properties. So another piece to keep in mind when you're thinking about land banks are one tool. They do not solve your blighted property problems. Let that sink in. It's just one additional tool in the toolbox that's set forth in that Blight to Bright manual as under certain conditions, a land bank is the choice of the tool to use for a particular property or set of properties. And then when you're thinking about land banking in terms of your overall strategy for looking at blighted properties, you want to make sure that the land bank's policies and practices are complementing local code enforcement, any community development plans, and again, effective tax collection and enforcement. Sometimes those activities and duties are spread between county government, local government, and other entities. So it requires collaboration and cooperation, but for land banks to work effectively, they should be used in concert with these other tools, especially code enforcement. So how do you create a land bank? As I mentioned, it's by ordinance. The land bank law sets forth some of the outlines for forming a land bank, and then it prescribes some governing and operating requirements. It can take many forms, and Pennsylvania has a full array of models for land bank structures that are going to be really useful if you're just getting started. So there's two basic options. You can create a land bank, which is a standalone land bank authority. Counties, municipalities with at least 10,000 population can form a land bank, or you can create a land bank by joining more than one municipality and operating jointly. Joe Chacke is going to speak about that. He's running a multi-municipal land bank up in Northeast PA. You can designate your redevelopment authority to act as a land bank. If you're in a land bank jurisdiction that fits within those, the description there on the slide, Andrew French is in a jurisdiction where they designated his redevelopment authority to act as the land bank. Here, the Housing Alliance maintains on its website a map of land banks in Pennsylvania, and you'll see here that land banks are spread across Pennsylvania, more so on the east and west parts of the states. There's a few in the center part of the state, but these are the land banks that have been created since 2013, I think is the first. And this chart's really useful to see. You can see the land banks and the year they were established. And if you look at the land banks that were established after 2018, that's the year when the land bank law was amended to allow for jurisdictions to designate their redevelopment authority to act as their land bank. And if you look at this list, from Fayette County was the first to do that. After Fayette County, I think 18 land banks were created. And of those 18, 15 are designated redevelopment authorities. So there's been a shift brought on by that legislative amendment to the Pennsylvania Land Bank law. So here's some land bank options that I mentioned. Land bank, standalone, Dauphin County Land Bank, first land bank created in Pennsylvania. Other options are Westmoreland County, that's your traditional county-based land bank that has member municipalities. And then the Philadelphia Land Bank, which exists for the city of Philadelphia, similar to the way the Pittsburgh Land Bank exists to serve the city of Pittsburgh. Then you have your designated RDAs, as I mentioned, Fayette County, the city of Altoona. I worked with them to designate their redevelopment authority to act as a land bank, and their operational Butler County's redevelopment authority is also designated as a land bank. And these are just some places that you can go look to their website, see what they're doing, and get a better sense of how land banks actually operate beyond the Land Banks 101 that we're working on today. And then your multi-municipal, as I mentioned, Northeast PA Land Bank, Tricog Land Bank in Allegheny County, and then the Schuylkill County Land Bank are all multi-municipal land banks. So when does it make sense for a community to create a land bank? And this is a struggle for me because I always think that a land bank might come in handy, right? So if you have a redevelopment authority in your jurisdiction and there's an opportunity to designate your land bank, I usually support that because it's just one more avenue to access properties that may be needed if you have a project in mind or if you want to assemble land for bigger projects. So in my mind, I always start with, okay, well, why wouldn't you create a land bank, right? What's the holdup? In some places, there just isn't a lot of blighted properties and a lot of properties that go to judicial tax sale. Now, I worked in one county where that was the instance, but there is a need for affordable housing. So sometimes communities will look to a land bank to see, will that give us another avenue to acquire and access land in order to develop sorely needed affordable housing. So when I talk about these conditions, this is the normal conditions for that. It's not the exclusive conditions for creating a land bank. Inflexible public policies often dictate creating a land bank because you don't want to be forced to transfer property to the highest bidder, right? Many properties have title problems and you want to be able to get access to those and be able to clear those titles and move the properties out. So if you have properties that have a lot of title problems, or you have properties, that have those clouds on their title, you want to consider maybe a land bank. And then last is those unpredictable and harmful outcomes from tax auctions. Sometimes people can bid on properties at a tax sale. They'll hold the property and do nothing to it. It continues to deteriorate until the next 3-year cycle in most counties, and then it goes back onto the tax rolls. So you don't want to always be forced to rely on that tax auction, especially for critical parcels that are important to the community and important to governmental functions. So who runs the land bank? Land banks are governed by a board of directors. And under the land bank law, at least one community representative has to sit on the board of directors. If a redevelopment authority is designated as a land bank, the authority's board acts as the land bank's board. For personnel, a land bank can hire or contract with staff, governmental entities, any really entity to administer and operate a land bank. And the norm in Pennsylvania and nationally is for shared staffing. And sometimes that's done under MOUs, memorandums of agreement, or other contracts to administer a land bank, because you don't always need to create a fully staffed entity in order to operate a land bank. It works best and is working well in Pennsylvania in most of the land banks with shared staffing across governmental agencies and entities. So I want to touch on 3 of the unique powers for Pennsylvania land banks that are different and beyond those of a redevelopment authority. Because I'll often get a question, why do I need a land bank if I have a redevelopment authority? And for many of the activities that you may want to engage in with respect to blighted properties, the redevelopment authority may be enough. But these 3 powers are powers that are unique to land banks and come in handy when you're trying to get this to scale when you have a large inventory of blighted property. So first, and the key power that usually leads communities to form a land bank, is this acquisition of judicial tax sale properties at a low cost using what's called a priority bid. Then we have expedited quiet title proceeding, and then the discharge of liens and claims. So acquisition at judicial tax sale, it's through a negotiating agreement with a tax claim bureau or other plaintiff tax foreclosing body. It's for a sum that's negotiated, usually the minimum bid price for that judicial tax sale property, and the land bank does not have to compete with other bidders. The land bank takes the property with free and clear title, like the statute for tax sales provides, but there's still some clouds that prevent you from getting insurance. So many of the land banks now are taking the properties they acquire through the quiet title process. And that's the next slide. A quiet title action is a lawsuit that is essentially, at the end result is that you are declared as the sole owner of the property. So there's no other claims or interest in the property except for yours. And land banks have special rules under the state land bank law, but again, the courts really dictate what the schedule is. You can point this out to them and hopefully they would follow these days for different things to occur, but it's up to the court. So here, if there's a hearing to be scheduled within 90 days, and then if there's no opposition or no one comes forward, the expectation is that you'd have a final judgment within 120 days of filing your quiet title action. Ability to discharge liens and claims, again, with the agreement of the taxing bodies, land banks can enter into intergovernmental cooperation agreements that provide for the discharge of those claims and liens on any property that the land bank acquires. Because the land bank's not only acquiring properties through judicial sale, land banks can acquire properties through direct purchase, through donation, municipal transfers. There's all kinds of options for land banks with respect to acquisition. It's just the priority bid is the focus of most land banks. Again, priority bid, just a quick example. I worked with the Pottstown Borough Land Bank for a number of years. They received a $200,000 fair grant. I think only half of that went to land bank activities. They worked with Montgomery County Tax Claim Bureau and they acquired 6 judicial sale properties. That might be up to 7 now, but here's one of the examples. This was acquired at judicial sale and sold to a local developer who took the property and invested over $130,000 to completely rehab the property, and then it was sold to a low mod income family for home ownership. Okay, so that's really the unique powers, right? We're talking about those 3 unique powers that are different from redevelopment authorities: priority bid, expedited quiet title process, and then the ability to negotiate an ICA where land banks' properties are free and clear of all liens and claims on it so that they can go ahead and market the property in the real estate market. So on disposition of properties, redevelopment authorities have similar broad discretion regarding property sales and disposition. under the land bank law, the language in the law is phenomenal. It really is broad, gives broad discretion to land banks. They can sell property for any amount and for any form of consideration. It doesn't even have to be money. And that is left for the land bank to determine what is appropriate. This is a real opportunity to foster more equitable development because the pressure is not on you to sell to the highest bidder, market it, and get the most you can for it. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't necessary for some of the properties because land bank funding is limited, but it just gives you an opportunity. You're not required to sell to the highest bidder. In land banks nationally and in Pennsylvania, the trend is to sell properties for affordable housing, to put those in the hands of developers or homeowners or renters who are in those income eligible households. So here's one example of that. In Philadelphia, there's a large inventory of already publicly owned land. So Philadelphia's land bank, working in concert with PHDC, the land bank, and city council, it's a partnership. The land bank issues RFPs for acquisition of groups of properties, and the income eligibility is 100% of area median income. Most of the new homes are 3-bedroom. It's new construction. The city funds some of the cost in order to make it more affordable. 20-year forgivable note is on there, and then resale is restricted to income qualified home buyers. There are some other duties that land banks have. They have to maintain a property inventory and make it available to the public. Most land banks are doing that on a web page or through some other public online resource that can be accessed by the public. Under the Sunshine Law, land banks are required to keep minutes and records of their proceedings, and they're also subject to the right to know law. And every year, land banks have to submit to DCED an annual audit of income and expenses and a report of activities. Community engagement, again, another critical issue for land banks. You need community support when you're acquiring properties at low cost and then disposing of them to an end user, sometimes for $1 a parcel, right? So that may get people concerned at the beginning. So in order to alleviate concerns and to make sure that your community members fully understand how land banks operate and the benefits that it brings to its processes, you want to have clear community engagement and education. Community members are encouraged or should be encouraged to suggest properties for acquisition by the land bank. They should also be given opportunities to purchase properties from the land bank. And then always the opportunity to comment on land bank policies and to be able to comment at public meetings. And then we already covered the representation on the land bank board. Partnerships, again, critical for land bank success. Land banks can't do everything. Some land banks have realtors that they work with to market their properties. They also work with lenders in order to qualify home buyers that can purchase from the nonprofit organization that might be the recipient of land bank properties. So you want to seek out those experts and partnerships that matter in your community because you're going to be so much better at achieving your outcomes and purpose if you have committed partners. So if you're thinking about a land bank and wondering if it's going to work for your community, take a quick look at these 3 questions. The first one I always get is, like, what are we gaining by bringing a land bank to the community? And then who do we need to get on board? And then how are we going to pay for this? So does the land bank add value? For me, these 4 things are the value add that land banks bring, and top of the list is blight removal. Second, assembling sites. And then third, by doing this work, you're showing and you're stimulating investment, private investment, which is essential. This cannot be achieved with only public dollars. And you want to get those properties back into the mainstream real estate market so that after you sell to a new owner, that owner has no barriers to selling the property to the next buyer. And then last is you're creating a uniform system that's driven by community input, and it leads to the the reuse of these properties in a manner that satisfies community objectives. Who needs to buy in? Just about everybody. So when you're starting, think about everybody in your community that you're going to want on board. First and foremost, elected officials. And that doesn't end after the land bank's created. There is a continuing need to re-educate newly elected officials and then to bring the existing elected officials up to speed with the work that you do so that they can be your biggest cheerleader. Public agency managers and staff, for sure, school districts, county tax claim bureau, residents, all of these entities need to be on board. And if you can encourage them and include them in the process from the start, you'll have a better success rate with getting funding and getting properties returned to the tax roll. How do we fund a land bank? Big, giant issue for Pennsylvania land banks. The statute provides for land banks to be able to seek public and private grants and loans. I will say that PHFA and the FAIR program has been a godsend for land banks in Pennsylvania. Some land banks have also applied and received local share account grants, which has also been a huge benefit for land banks. Other ways to fund a land bank are by requesting or demanding contributions from municipalities and counties that are part of the land bank. The 550 tax recapture, I can sum up in one sentence. It's once a land bank returns a property to productive use, the land bank can engage with the taxing bodies, school district, county, and local government to enter into that ICA whereby once the property is returned to the tax rolls, for the next 5 years, the land bank receives 50% of the taxes collected, right? Taxes have to be collected and it has to be, it can't be more than 5 years and it can't be more than 50%. Land banks keep the proceeds from any sales or leases. There's also authority to float bonds for land banks, but no land bank has issued bonds yet. And I think that's a little ways off in the future. But if you want to have a successful land bank, recurring dedicated funding is what you need. And that is not clear in Pennsylvania for all land banks. If you want to look at a real unique way of funding, I suggest that you look at the TriCog land banks funding mechanism. And if anybody's interested in learning more about that, I'm happy to connect you to Ann Lewis or Nat Boydston at that land bank, or call me and I can explain it to you. But that's one way that they took what Ohio is doing. Their land banks are very well funded, and they use that model to create something similar that works in their jurisdiction and with their municipal members. So now I've been waiting for this point because I have worked with Joe and Andrew over the last many years to bring land banks and knowledge about land banks to Pennsylvania communities. And I'm going to start off by asking first Joe and then Andrew, if you would just tell us a little bit about your background and your work and what drew you to land banks. Joe, you want to start?
Sure. I've been in local government my entire adult life. I started with the city of Pittston as its executive director of its redevelopment authority 13 years ago. So that was 2012. And, one of the things that we wanted to address from the very beginning was, blight in the neighborhoods. And we were around during the creation of the land bank law in 2013 or 2012? It was possibly. We were one of the early people to explore that. And I've been doing blight ever since.
That's great. How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, so I started in the community development business in 1994. I was with the cities of Newport News and Hampton, Virginia. And then I came to Fayette County in 1999 with their redevelopment authority, and have been here ever since. In all those roles, I think the primary work that I've been engaging in is community development, but also a lot of blight abatement, a lot of affordable housing development, a lot of infrastructure work, a lot of economic development. So a myriad of activities, but I would say a lot of our focus has always been, and as redevelopment authorities, I think that's why we were created in the beginning, was to deal with blighted properties and try to spur community development and redevelopment types of activities. So I know in 2012, when the land bank legislation was passed, we were very, very interested in it and kind of played with it for a while. And as Winnie, as you indicated, we kind of decided to take a different approach because we kind of felt like, as a redevelopment authority, we've always been doing land banking activities. It was just a little bit different than a traditional land bank. So we were glad to work with our state senator Stefano to get Act 33 passed and kind of open that door for other redevelopment authorities throughout the Commonwealth.
That's great. And so, Joe, what are you working on right now? What's a project that you want to tell us about that you're working on right now?
There's actually two I'd like to briefly talk
Sure.
about. So the first one is we're doing rehabs of two properties that we acquired. Both properties were vacant for a very long time. They needed a lot of work. We're putting about $550,000 of grant money into both of them, fully remodeling from top to bottom. And that's been funded by both a local share account grant and some ARPA dollars that we got. And so they're nearing completion, and we're pretty excited about that. We're gonna rent those to some low to moderate income residents. And the most recent project that we're really excited about is one of the things that the land bank ends up doing is acquiring a bunch of vacant lots, mostly that have been vacant forever, nobody wants. And so we've identified a bunch, and we received some funding through FAIR to do this, what we're calling our mod home initiative, which is basically we're going to construct modular homes on some of these lots with the idea either to sell or rent to low to moderate income residents. So we just awarded a contract last month on that. And so we're excited to get that construction underway. And we have two properties that we're starting with, where we have a third in queue. So, those are the two big projects we're working right now. Prior to these projects, we mostly did acquisition and demolition. So this is our first foray into this type of work.
Well, that's incredible. So when you said you awarded the contract, so as a contractor is doing the build of the modular housing?
Yeah, so it's an arm of one of the modular home builders. They do kind of like a little bit of everything. So, they bid on the project, and they'll be doing it all.
That's terrific. And then for the other project you mentioned, is that the first time you're going to be renting properties?
Yeah, it's the first time we've other than selling, we've never done rentals. So this is our first, entry into that market. We're going to partner with, we do a little bit of everything up here. So we're going to partner with one of our nonprofit entities to manage that for the land bank. We're going to utilize like housing authority staff to help with stuff like that. So it's synergistic up here. So we try to do a little bit of everything.
And that's terrific, because that just demonstrates a little bit of the evolution of land banks in Pennsylvania. Because I'm going to go to a slide that's in here that was from, I think we did this PARA conference together a couple of years back. And I would ask you to talk a little bit about the priority bid. And this was like the norm, right? You would acquire a property for using priority bid, and then you would demolish the structure because it was a blighted structure. And I love that you said neighbors celebrated, because that is usually the response for projects like this. So you've really come a long way from this traditional land bank project to the ones that you just described, and that's really so exciting.
Yeah, exactly. We've had a couple of those early on. We acquired some of these properties that look like that or worse for decades. And when we acquire them and we demolish them, then we have a couple stories where residents are actually tearful out in the streets. And that property that you just showed is actually something else we've done a couple times now. Is Habitat for Humanity just acquired that property from us, and they're constructing a home on that site. So that'll be the third one we've done with Habitat for Humanity. So that's pretty exciting as well.
That's great. Oh, I can't wait to update that slide when that project's done. And Andrew, tell us a little bit about something you're working on right now.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of different initiatives and projects. And again, this is how we kind of navigate when I'm wearing my land bank hat versus my redevelopment hat. So, I mean, we've got typically in any year, we'll administer between $5 to $7 million in funding. The height of pandemic, it was like 2.5 times that amount of funding that we were able to administer. But some of the more land bank leaning types of initiatives, we've got one major commercial structure in a little community called Brownsville, PA, that we acquired years ago from an absentee landlord, severely blighted property. And in fact, there were a number of severely blighted commercial properties, but we decided to kind of focus a lot of our effort towards this main anchor building in Brownsville. And we've made small strides over the years, but working with Senator Casey, when he was in, we were able to get $1 million appropriation through the congressionally directed spending. So we're kind of trying to work through that process to see what type of meaningful project we can have with that particular property. We also applied for some funding through EPA and are looking at RCAP funding as well, because it's going to take a pretty significant investment to help stabilize that property. We also have a development. We continue to work with a community housing development organization, a CHODO. So we've done a number of different projects with a group called Threshold Housing, where we kind of work as the redevelopment authority to acquire property and then repurpose the property to put in all the infrastructure. We've probably and then Threshold actually operates a self-help housing program that's funded through USDA. So, and that's for new construction, single family, affordable housing. And then we also use a myriad of the other funding sources through HOME, the county's affordable housing funding, PHFA. But we've done probably over 120 new constructed homes with them over the years. And we've actually got another piece of property that we're acquiring through the county that is kind of vacant, underutilized property. And so we've been working with them to create another housing development that'll probably be about 40 units in a community called Manalapan Township.
That's so exciting. And Andrew, your comments underscored a couple of things. One is commercial properties are in the mix for land banks, right? And they're not restricted to just residential properties. You mentioned key partners, Threshold Housing, right? A nonprofit housing, a CHODO. You mentioned USDA for funding. Like, these are all things that land bank leaders across Pennsylvania are doing. They're piecing together all of the pieces of a puzzle that leads to a successful project at the end. So your experience and your projects that you're working on, both of you demonstrate that. And I know I'm getting close to time, so I think I'm going to stop my questioning and turn it back over. But first, let me just do this too. That's the priority bid I mentioned. And again, Redevelopment Authority of Fayette County. Andrew was the leader who pushed for the Act 33. And he did such a great job talking about why this was important for redevelopment authorities that might not be the most populated or the most more urban-centered types of redevelopment authorities, and that really opened the gate for land banks in other communities in Pennsylvania. And then there'll be resources, go and look at land bank websites, and then I included our contact information. So I'm going to stop sharing now. These will be shared with everybody, and then ask Chris or Jen to talk about the questions that came up in the chat or the Q&A.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you all. We do have a few questions in the Q&A section. So I'm going to start off with the first one, which is, do land banks typically have success in getting the taxing bodies to forgive the back taxes on properties? Also, have you ever had the tax bodies agree ahead of time to forgive taxes on any future properties put into the land bank? School districts seem to be difficult on this issue in my experience. Not my experience, but the person who asked this. Thank you for your question, by the way.
Joe, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this was being one of the first land banks and definitely the first up in Northeast Pennsylvania. This whole educational part of talking to school directors, county officials, they didn't understand this concept at all. We run into this idea of ghost revenue where You know, on paper, they're supposed to receive these taxes from these properties. They're actually not, but you know, you've got to get through this whole educational process. So we struggled with that for what was one of the first things we had to deal with. It took a long time to get everybody on board, but we enter into these agreements with all the taxing bodies, the cities, the townships, the boroughs, the school districts, the county. And within that agreement, they all agree to exonerate, extinguish, however you want to phrase that, any tax liens of all the properties that we acquire at all times. And they also
And that's
agree
done
to
in
the
advance.
they also agree to the 550 tax share revenue once we return it to the tax roll. So yeah, we put that all within our agreements. And like I said, it just took a lot of education, a lot of time to explain, you know, why they want to do this, why it benefits them. You know, so yeah, so we've done that successfully up here.
Thank you, Joe. We do have a few other questions in the chat. So the next one is, do you have any examples of how a nonprofit and a local or state government might collaborate effectively on land bank administration?
Yeah, just about every land bank in Pennsylvania, there is some MOU to provide some kind of support for administering the land bank. I only think of TriCog, they have their own staff, but even that's through the COG. So there's always, there's a multitude of examples in the existing land banks. I mean, even just what Andrew was talking about, the different hats that he wears. So many of the land bank leaders wear multiple hats, and they use the powers or access to resources that they can in each one of those compartments. So yeah, there's I'd say almost every land bank. And if you want something more specific, I'm happy to communicate with you. I can get the contact information from Chris.
Thank you, Winnie. Another question that we have is, what paperwork needs to be filed by a redevelopment authority who has just been designated as a land bank?
Andrew, well, I think the state law says you need to amend you have to file some paperwork with the Department of State. First, you have to file your ordinance with
Correct.
DCED, and then you file the ordinance, and I think it's a request for an amendment. I forget what the actual language is. I can share that with the slides, Chris, and then you can circulate that too, which will say what redevelopment authorities have to file with the Department of State when they create a land bank.
Yeah, it's relatively easy process. I mean, it's, you know, you do have to do the advertising and get the ordinance adopted by the commissioners, but it's a pretty streamlined process.
Thank you, Winnie and Andrew. We do have one more question. I am wondering why Philadelphia has both a land bank and a redevelopment authority.
That question is asked all the time. The land bank has powers that the redevelopment authority doesn't have. So it's really to supplement redevelopment authority's powers, but there are similar powers. Some places don't need the priority bid. They don't need expedited quiet title, and they figured out ways to, you know, relieve or extinguish taxes otherwise. So I'm a Philadelphia resident, and I remember when the land bank was being created, that was a frequently asked question, and the answer was the land bank's going to be a platform or a system whereby we can do these blighted property interventions at scale.
Thank you, Winnie. We do have two more questions. What are the differences between land banks and land trusts, and can they work together?
Well, I'm going to jump in on this one, and then I'll ask Andrew and Joe too. A community land trust is a form of ownership that creates permanently affordable housing. The land trust owns the land, and the resident owns the structure, the house. Community land trusts and land banks are natural partners. There is a great resource on the Center for Community Progress's website that was written by Kim Graziani, and it addresses that exact topic. So I would recommend checking that out and looking further at it. But they're natural partners, and it's happening across the United States where community land trusts are being formed, and they're working with land banks to acquire land in order to put affordable homes in the hands of people that need them. Andrew or Joe, do either one of you work with any community land trusts?
We do not. I've had some conversations about it, and I think it's, like you said, Winnie, it's a kind of a newer trend that seems to be peaking around the country, probably due to the increased costs in housing. It's just a tool to get some long-term affordability for housing. So we kind of do that with the housing that we develop with our CHODO. I mean, there are certain deed restrictions placed on the property that if it, if they don't retain the property as their primary residence, that, it either has to be sold to another low or moderate income homeowner, or the funds have to be returned and then we kind of recycle the funding back into the program. But land trusts, yeah, again, it's a different tool that some communities might be able to take advantage of.
And Chris, before we wrap up, I just want to say a couple things. There's a PARA conference. Andrew, do you want to talk about the PARA conference, June 24 and 25? Are they the right dates in Gettysburg?
I think you've got the right dates. We can.
Yeah.
We
It's the
can get that
Pennsylvania
done.
Association of Housing and Redevelopment Authorities. They have a conference in June in Gettysburg, and there's going to be 4 sessions that are dedicated to land banks. And then the Homes Within Reach conference that the Housing Alliance puts on in December, there's going to be again a blight track of 8 or so sessions. And then I just want to also, and that's December 3rd through 5th. Yeah, those
I
are the
think
dates. I
so,
have that down. And then lastly, if you are thinking about creating a land bank, or you're at your infant stages, you've already passed the ordinance and you want to learn more, and you haven't joined the Pennsylvania Land Bank Network, this is an initiative through, it's through the Housing Alliance, but there are land bank leaders now across Pennsylvania working to really create a more robust community. Right now, we have a listserv, we have a resource hub, and we have quarterly meetings. If you're in a local government or county government, and you're a redevelopment authority and you're thinking about land banks, please reach out to me or Chris at the Housing Alliance and say you're interested, and we'll be back in touch with details.
Thank you, Winnie. We do have time to get to a few more questions.
Oh, okay.
So,
Oh, good. I was thinking it was done at 12:20. Let's
no,
get some more
12:30.
questions.
So the next question we have is, the quiet title action seems like a frustrating additional hurdle. Are the service requirements adjusted? Has that piece slowed down the process?
I will say it does slow down the process because you have to go through that legal proceeding. But if you need that title at the end, if you're going to be selling to somebody who needs to get financing. So the trend in Pennsylvania now, we're seeing more land banks file quiet title actions on almost every property that they're acquiring. Some don't. If you're going to, land banks acquire properties, demolish structures, and then they'll sell that lot to a neighbor. So for those instances, some land banks are saying there's no real value in, we don't need to do that because we're not in that position right now. It's usually cost, right? If you can get through a quiet title action in 120 days, at the end of that process, the value of that land is increased because there's no further action that needs to be taken for that property to return to the market and be sold freely. So the goal for land banks is to eliminate those barriers, right? And if you long-term are looking to support your local real estate market, you want to have clear title. But the cost is sometimes an impediment, and some land banks are not doing that. They'll do a transfer using a quitclaim deed, and they'll say, if you want to file a quiet title action after you've acquired the property, you have the opportunity to do that. So it does delay a little bit, and it is an additional cost, but I've seen some land banks negotiate great deals with law firms to do them on a per property basis, assuming there's no opposition and it's just the paperwork filing, no real hearing or any other investigation. And they've worked those out sometimes as low as $1,500 a property. So it's not crazy. And you should work with your local bar association or law firms to see if they can help you if you're interested in pursuing quiet title.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that is we when we first started, we took the blanket approach. We're going to get a quiet title on every property we acquire. That process is, even though they have the expedited timeline, getting the notice to all the people, especially banks that no longer exist, and all that notification process is very difficult at times. So we've taken the approach now where it's a case-by-case basis. We will reduce, or we'll take a very low purchase price if you take the quiet title action on yourself, the purchaser, or if you want us to do it, we charge a fee to do that. So we're doing it on a case-by-case basis now.
Yeah, I think that makes sense too, because you can't expect unless you're gonna pay a higher premium for the land, and land banks don't know how that's gonna work out. So if you're pushing to get the land bank property, it's great to just add an additional fee, because the land bank can get the expedited quiet title proceeding, whereas an average person can.
Thanks, Winnie and Joe. We do have another question for Andrew. Andrew, you mentioned 120 new homes developed. Were those large tracts of land or individual plots? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so some of them were individual plots. We did a lot. If everybody or if anybody recalls the neighborhood stabilization program that came out, I think it was President Bush. So we did a lot of different scattered site development with Threshold using that funding. We also did some major large tracts. So we had one site, the last site that we did in a community called Redstone Township, was a property that was owned by our housing authority, who actually ended up demolishing their public housing. It kind of had outlived its useful life. And then we were able to acquire that property from them and put in about 50 single family homes on that site. So it's been a combination. This other particular site that we're looking at, again, is a vacant, it's an old coal patch community that the county acquired years ago. So we're actually, and there's no housing, no structures on it now, but we're looking at repurposing that property. So it'll be another larger acre development.
Thanks, Andrew. We have one last question left. If a community organization helps administer a land bank, would the organization be working on a volunteer basis? Does the funding include labor expended?
I think it would, there has to be like a professional arrangement. It can't be volunteer, I don't think. I think if it's an organization that is in your community and they have the resources to provide those services for free, but I haven't seen that as part of any model. There's usually some compensation, some payment to the entity that's administering the land bank. Andrew, Joe, do you have anything else?
Just, we're a multi-municipal land bank, so the city was the initiator of the pursuit of this land bank. So the city has taken on the responsibility to pay for the staff that runs the land bank. What I just mentioned earlier about doing the rentals, we're going to partner with one of our nonprofits that we created here to, administer and maintain those properties. And we're going to take a small fee of the rents that were received to cover some of the administrative costs. That's how we're doing it. I don't know if Andrew has anything different there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be a dedicated staff, and you've got to be able to build that capacity locally. And I think, again, it varies from community to community. So we've just kind of evolved in Fayette County that, to act in the role that we are in. I know that that's a huge need that we've talked about, Winnie, with the Land Bank Network is how do we find additional resources to help build that local capacity and maintain that local capacity for not only land banks, but redevelopment authorities, community development agencies, just so you have those different entities on the ground that are kind of doing this difficult work that we're all involved in.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the funding side, you think about the issues that we've raised at the Land Bank Network. There's often grants for acquiring properties. It's for specific sites and for specific projects, but there's not a clear path to a lot of funding for the administration, the operations, the day-to-day work of staff to do that. So we rely on those partnerships that Joe and Andrew both described.
I think we're at time. Thank you, Winnie, Joe, and Andrew, for sharing all this incredible information with us. We're really grateful and we appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I will be emailing out the presentation, the recording, and any other materials that were shared today with you all within a week of this webinar. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.